now, if we turn to Khaled al-Fadl, he's a contemporary scholar, also based in the U.S., of Egyptian origin. He grew up a significant part of his childhood in Kuwait. I guess his father was working there as an expatriate worker. And so he's exposed to the Salafi Islam and the Khalij. He comes back to Egypt, and he gets into this real intolerant, ignorant Salafi phase, and then he starts studying with shuyukh in Egypt. He ends up graduating from some Egyptian governmental university, I believe. I'm not exactly sure where he got his bachelor's, but he went to America for postgraduate studies. He studied in Princeton. Now, Princeton is one of the foremost Orientalist institutions in North America, and their department was founded by Bernard Lewis, who is a major Orientalist. He graduated from there, and he ended up becoming a professor of Islamic studies at UCLA. And so he's written a number of books. One is called Speaking in God's Name, which focuses entirely upon the whole issue of this conservative patriarchal interpretation of the texts. And he has very incisive, rational, and argumentative skills. So, he makes the objects of his study look pretty ridiculous. And then he has another book called something to this effect, like "None Knows the Soldiers Except God" or "But God," something like that. It's taken from that Quranic verse, وَلَا يَعْلَمُ جُنُودَ رَبِّكَ إِلَّا هُ. And then the subtitle is "The Authoritative and the Authoritarian in Islamic Discourse," and in which he does this really systematic taking apart of somebody's writing on a topic of concern to Muslims in the 1990s in America, and he demonstrates a lot of tendencies that he doesn't like in the Islamic discourse. And then he has another book called Search for Beauty in Islam, from which I will read you a portion. And before I do that, I just mentioned that in his book on Speaking in God's Name, he has an extensive discussion of that hadith of Abu Bakr. And he doesn't reject the Sunnah in a wholesale manner. But he has this whole principle that he does a whole different take on criteria for how rigorously we should look at testing a hadith's authenticity. There's a famous position that if a hadith is dealing with aqidah issues, that it has to be, on the level of the Qur'an as far as authenticity. It has to be mutawatir. Although there are plenty of scholars who don't accept that. They say if it's authentic, then it's accepted. Anyway, but there's that whole idea of hadith have to pass a higher standard of authentication if they're dealing with a certain type of issue. And he takes that and he brings it around from a different angle. He says the more impact a given hadith has upon people's lives, the more stringent the conditions should be for determining its authenticity. So an isolated hadith that has a huge impact on people's lives should be approached with more caution. than an isolated hadith that has a very minimal impact. And so then he goes into this whole hadith of Abu Bakr, not Abu Bakr, that no nation will prosper that makes a woman their supreme leader. And he doesn't talk about, he doesn't approach it from the angle of isnad and that matter, as far as textual authenticity. But he approaches it from a completely different angle, which is very much in line with this postmodernist hermeneutics that there's a community dealing with texts and their concerns are manifested in the type of importance they give to one text or another, and that he analyzes Abu Bakr's political stances and all the fitna that was swirling around between Ali and those who were opposed to him, and that he made this statement with regard to Aisha in the army that ended up fighting against Ali's forces in the Battle of the Camel. So he goes into a lot of discussion about Abu Bakr and his particular take on politics and take on women and why this affects the hadith. Anyway, it's long and complicated, too long to go into here. With regard to the search for beauty of Islam, he gives us a detailed example. Now, when he talks about hermeneutics in speaking in God's name, his take on the Qur'an is just it's hard to make out what he's saying. He coaches it in a lot of kind of references to these Western scholars of hermeneutics and this postmodern and all this stuff. When we look at an example of how he approaches the interpretation of a specific verse, it's much clearer there in The Search for Beauty in Islam. And he starts out this little chapter by saying, I ask my God for a guideline, and I always find it in beauty. For my guide is beautiful and sublime. How can the beautiful demand of us anything but the beautiful? If there is a beauty to life, it is that we derive from the magnanimity of God the urge for the beautiful and the refined. So this is very in line with the Mu'tazili idea that there's a fitrah that recognizes virtue. That virtue is, as it's mentioned in the Quranic terminology, hasana comes from a word that's related to beautiful, and sayyi'ah, a sin, is from a word that's related to ugliness. So virtue is beautiful and sin is ugly, and that there's this innate human recognition of what is right and wrong. So then he starts discussing a woman who comes to him for consultation about her husband who's beating her. She tells me with a face solemn with emotion that her husband struck her and that although she suffered no pain, she cannot accept aggression. The imam in the mosque advised her that her husband is her guardian, and God has decreed that a beating is not in that case a transgression. If she's seeking a divorce, this is not a sufficient cause, because an opportunity to perfect humility is hardly lost. If you've disobeyed, the imam said, then you are defiant. An ash is in the book of God is an arrogant woman who does not see her husband as her boss. But she tells me that it is not her desire for divorce that guides her as much as it is a sense of betrayal, feeling that her dignity and the dignity of her husband are not treated as of the same nature or worth is treachery of the worst kind. She goes on to say, if my husband has to resort to the ugliness of violence, then he is hardly to be entrusted with such a right. In other words, the right of guardianship, the qiwama. Al-Fadl says, now he's addressing the woman, he says, this mind, referring to his own, he said, this mind can flow with reflections and thoughts, but do not expect from me any conclusions. So he's engaged in a sort of a contemplation of the text that relate to the issue of beating a woman. And he says, it's reported from Ali that he said that before Islam, if a man struck his wife, the shame of that act would plague him and his descendants for many years to come. How could such a shameful act be sanctioned after Islam when Islam is the liberator? So the woman responds, but the verses. The Imam based his opinion on verses and not reason. So then he's doing a sort of a voiceover. He's relating this conversation to us with occasionally reporting his own thoughts. I'm torn when speaking to my fellow Muslim, for I see much beauty in reason. We do not worship an irrational God. So then he starts addressing her directly. The Qur'an says, as for those women who you fear their nushuz, admonish them, abandon their beds, and beat them. If they obey you, do not seek to persecute them, for God is high and greater than you all. Verse 34 from An-Nisa. And if you, goes on to say, if you fear a breach between them, the man and the wife, appoint an arbiter from his people and an arbiter from her people. If they desire amendment, Allah will make them of one mind. Indeed, Allah is ever knower, aware. Okay, basically we've run out of time here. So I'm going to refer you to what I copied of his discussion in that chapter. Now, I didn't write the whole chapter because I was just running out of energy and time. I did write about 4 pages worth. And he basically goes into the meaning of the word nushuz and nashes and how it's used for a man in another verse in Surah An-Nisa. And so normally you would expect it to mean the same thing in the same kind of context, because it's talking again about nushuz between husband and wife. So does that mean that if a husband is nashes that he's disobeying his wife, or that it has some other meaning? And then he goes into talking about a hadith that interprets nushuz as fahisha mubayyina, that it's a grave and major sin, a grave and well-known sin, and it's related to sexual indiscretion that falls short of actual intercourse, or that there aren't 4 witnesses for it, or that the witnesses did not actually see the act, the organ entering the organ, which would make stoning the penalty for it. So anyway, he goes into a lengthy discussion of what exactly does nushuz mean, and then he goes into the whole issue of who is the verse being addressed to when it says beat them. Is it husbands, or is it the community, and therefore the authorities of the community who are there to punish women who are engaged in gross acts of disobedience to Allah? So it's an interesting discussion. I mean, it's definitely not the traditional interpretation. I would advise, if you can get your hands on that book, The Search for Beauty in Islam, that you read it and make up your mind about his arguments. Finally, before we leave, we have these scholars who are influenced by the postmodernist approach to hermeneutics. You have Muhammad Arkoun, who's an Algerian, who did all his studies basically in France. France is the den of these postmodernists. Jacques Derrida, Michel Foucault, and basically he took their ideas and he just applied it to the Islamic text. He was the right person at the right time. And there's slots open in those institutions for Muslims who will do those things. And you have Nasr Abu Zayd, Nasr Hamid Abu Zayd, who is an Egyptian professor of tafseer at Cairo University. And he wrote a number of books on hermeneutics that are heavily based on communication theory or information theory, pioneered by Claude Shannon, mathematician at MIT, who basically invented information theory. And he wrote what is supposed to be the most important master's thesis in history, in which he basically showed how you can applied Boolean algebra to electrical circuits, and therefore he laid the whole basis for the digital computer. And I mean, he was one of the most brilliant minds of the 20th century. So he had some theories on communication, and so Nasr Abu Zayd, apparently, he read some of this stuff, and he applied it to approaching the Quranic text. And he got in trouble when it came time for him to be considered for full professorship instead of associate professorship. Two of the three people on his committee, the committee making the decision, they approved, one highly disapproved, and it became a big controversy, and he ended up being denied tenure. And then it didn't stop there. An Islamist who had nothing to do with him took his situation to court. They said, this man has expressed ideas that make him a non-Muslim, and therefore his marriage to his wife is no longer valid. And the first court threw it out, and the appeals court ruled in favor of the plaintiff, who had nothing to do with his situation. And so basically, that higher court declared him to be a non-Muslim. Throughout the whole controversy, he said, I believe in the Qur'an. I believe that it's from Allah. And, it's just my interpretation that you disagree with, and you can't call me a disbeliever because of my interpretation. And despite that, the court declared him a disbeliever, and then he started receiving death threats. And so he basically had to leave Egypt. And he ended up being offered a professorship at a university in Holland, which is where he lives today. His wife, who remains married to him, she is also a professor, or she was a professor at the same university. She makes occasional trips back to Egypt, but he has not set foot back in Egypt since 1995. Anyway, he has some books on hermeneutics, and some of them are, at least articles, are beginning to be published, translated into English. There's some of his stuff supposedly on the web. When I went to look for it, the website that was supposed to have the article didn't have anything there. It was an empty site. But he's another influential person who is probably better than Muhammad Arkoun, although they tend to be classified in the same larger category. We're just scratching the surface here, and again, these are people who these kind of voices will continue, and a person needs to understand the arguments that they put forward for their methodology, and understand where the shortcomings are, and at the very least, you have to understand something before you pass judgment on it. So we have to at least understand what they're saying, and then pass judgment on it. If once you reach a conclusion upon them, then you can busy yourself with other things. But it's important that we know what they're saying and form an opinion about it, because these voices are not going to go away. And so educated Muslims need to know what they're saying and come to a conclusion about it, and if the need be, to be prepared to refute them. And Allah knows best. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.